Historians are mainly in agreement now that race is a modern concept.
Adam Hockman from Macquarie University. This is the Philosopher's Zone, today on the question of race.
My name is Justin Smith, and I'm a professor of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Paris 7.
Justin Smith is a prolific contributor to Public Ideas. Check out his blog if you haven't seen it. His most recent work is on a philosophical history of race and how philosophers contributed to the creation of the concept. So, how far back do we need to go?
There is no word for race in Latin. There are various approximate terms like nation or like genus, from which we get genus. And these are used in ways that look a lot like what we mean by race, but not entirely. For one thing, these terms don't typically pick out transnational groups that share physical characteristics. So people only start talking about race when they stop writing in Latin, which is over the period of, let's say, the 16th into the 17th centuries. When it first appears, interestingly, in Italian, and then shortly after that in French, it is used to describe something it still describes in those languages today, but not in English, namely the races or breeds of pigeons, horses, dogs, and so on. So the earliest use of the term race is in contexts of animal husbandry or domestic breeding. And it makes a leap from there to the description of human social reality sometime in the mid-17th century. But it does so in a very peculiar way. It's not borrowed from the domestic breeding of animals to the description of what we think of as race, but rather for the description of lineages, in particular aristocratic lineages. And this is why Leibniz is so interesting in the history of the concept of race, because he is, among many other things, a professional historian, a professional genealogist of the House of Brunswick. And so we see him talking about the race of the House of Brunswick, meaning the marriages and generations that extend back to the Middle Ages in this noble family. And then it gradually extends out from particular human families to describe, again, what in Latin would have been described as nationes, as nations. But this involves a presumption that nations are lineages in a way that is somewhat like a big family. But we're still very far away here.
That's not race, is it?
That's still not race in our sense. We're still very far away here from the sense of race as, again, a transnational group in which all members share physical characteristics. The usual kind of point of origin of that particular usage of race is a character named François Bernier, who is very interesting. I could say a lot of things about him. In 1684, back in Paris, he publishes an article called A New Division of the Earth. A New Division of the Earth. A New Division of the Earth. A New Division of the Earth, in which he proclaims, hitherto men have divided up the earth into nations. I am going to divide it up into a few more basic categories, which he then goes on to call races or species. And then he goes on to list 4 or 5 broad groupings, which somewhat map on to what we see later in the 18th century, the kind of typical divisions that would later emerge of the Mongolian, the Negroid, the Caucasoid, and so on. But it's not quite there yet. One notable difference is that East Asians are classified as white, which shows how malleable these categories have been all along. Now, this is an interesting moment, and what I argue is that we get 2 possible conceptions of race that are developing around the same time in the work of Leibniz on the one hand and in the work of Bernier on the other, and that Bernier would ultimately and unfortunately triumph for the next several centuries. So, at this moment, what is effectively occurring is that Bernier is making race into species in the sense of that which is inspectable. And rather than Leibniz's approach, which explicitly, particularly in works where he's not directly speaking about race, but Leibniz over and over again says that the kind of thing in question is not something that is dependent on morphology. And this is in his response to John Locke, where Locke is saying that, morphologically speaking, if a human being resembles an ape too much, then at some point there's a cutoff point, and that could no longer be a human being, whereas Leibniz says, nonsense. Humanness is not something that is dependent on physical conformation or morphology.
Yeah, and this is interesting because that then buys back into a universal humanism, or at least humans in a universal conceptual setting.
That's right.
But in fact, what Bernier's obviously responding to are some pretty rapid and important changes in the scientific world, in the taxonomic world,
Sure.
which swept in human beings. Sure. And I think you make this point, a very interesting point, that it was the grounding of man and woman in nature that actually made this race issue what it is.
That's right. The reason for this is that there's a sort of classification mania that is pervading all of European natural science. This goes in particular back to the Renaissance with the rediscovered interest in Aristotle's biological works in the mid-16th century, with the kind of growing awareness of the inadequacy of Aristotle's biological works for accounting for all of the diversity of nature. And obviously here, the fact that we're now in the age of exploration is crucial.
One can understand in a practical sense why this is happening, because, you know, these classification systems were burgeoning. This is a way of thinking, a way of understanding the world. What I'm interested in, though, is that you also talk about how dualism didn't actually lose its footing completely, that in fact it did work over a period of time with this new naturalisation of the human being to create the situations that were, you know, for race to be seen as a construct.
Sure.
How does that work?
Dualism served as a sort of bulwark or barrier to the sudden and total rise of sort of naturalized racial realism. And this is, I think, most clear in the opposition between the views of John Locke on the one hand and Leibniz on the other. Locke and Leibniz never had a direct debate, but Leibniz's New Essays of Human Understanding of 1704 are in some sense a reply to Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding of 1690. And here we see very clearly Leibniz taking up a position against Locke's view that in Africa there are creatures of which it is impossible to say whether they're human or not, the product of hybrid matings between, it's always human women and male apes. There are interesting gender presuppositions there that we don't need to get into. But Locke says, are they human? Who knows? This is a question of how we ourselves want to classify. Whereas for Leibniz, it's always very clear that the classification of a creature as a human being does not come from us and will not be decided by an inspection of how much hair it has on its body or whether it has a vestigial tail or something like that. There are other examples that I could draw on. Descartes, for example, clearly has nothing at all to say about human diversity. He explicitly brackets the question in order to pursue, let's say, a more abstract investigation of what it is to be a human being.
It gets in the way for him, doesn't it? I mean,
it would get in the way if he were willing to address the question. He has a different project, but I think Cartesian philosophy supports my argument that dualism was a bulwark against racism, or against, let's say, the essentialization of human diversity.
I can see why there would be some criticism to that, because if you draw a line from there, you could draw it to say, well, the decline of religion as a house for this kind of conceptual idea, the decline of it in the face of the rise of science and naturalization of all things. This is one of the things you're going to have to face, that you will have something like racism.
Sure. And I suppose one has to stress a kind of additional point that if you're looking at, say, the Spanish perception of the Native Americans, this is in many respects pre-racial. There is rather little discussion of the physical appearance of Native Americans by the Spanish. At least they don't take this to be particularly important in their attempts to size up what a Native American is and what a Native American's soul is like. So it's pre-racial in that sense, but of course that does nothing to prevent the extermination and enslavement. Even in the history of slavery, it's not as if in the 15th century, Portuguese slave traders went down the coast of West Africa looking for black Africans because they had an a priori commitment to the inferiority of this group of people. Rather, they were, for political reasons, blocked from the traditional source of slaves, which was the Ottoman Empire. They needed to look somewhere else. So they went to a different region of the world, and so began the rise of modern transatlantic slavery. But this didn't require a philosophical justification in order to get started. The philosophical account, or let's say the rise of scientific racism, is an afterthought.
Justin Smith, Professor of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Paris, 7. His latest work is on race in early modern philosophy.